Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Kashor, and I am the Li Ka-shing Professor in Public Management at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I am also important for today's webinar and book launch, helping build the efforts to create the Lee Kuan Yew School's Public Policy Institute on Environment and Sustainability, which is very important for our speaker today and for all of you. It is my great pleasure to welcome and be the chair of this book launch, and also a conversation with one of our new faculty at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Sreeja Nair, who has, as we'll hear in the coming hour and 15 minutes, written a book that was so well received on policy pilots that it was published by Cambridge University Press, the world's leading publisher in the field that Sreeja works in. And the reason this is an important book is that governments are always wondering how to best develop policy innovations around particularly vexing policy challenges in ways that can bring society and stakeholders along with them, and also iron out wrinkles. So how to do that in a way that's effective and efficient and can help governments solve problems is really one of the most critically important questions facing this world, facing countries, and of course, one of the key questions facing the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where we specialize in both policy, in policy innovation and policy design. So with that, I want to introduce then Sreeja Nair, give you a little bit of background on her, and then I'm going to discuss the plan for today, and then turn it over to her to make some opening remarks. So Sreeja Nair is, what's important to know about her is that she is an interdisciplinary policy researcher who specializes in sustainability, environmental policy, and governance. And she studies policy processes and the tools of governments for designing policies under uncertainty, focusing especially on the interplay of science and politics. And I can't think of a more important set of questions given the climate crisis, what happened recently in Glasgow, and of course, the broader interaction effects that she'll be talking about today. So her work then covers issues facing high uncertainty in the future in the context of climate change, as well as associated food and water security, and more recently on digital transformation and workforce resilience. She has over 9 years of research experience on policy aspects of environmental change and resource degradation in Asia. And she's led multidisciplinary teams that focus on climate change adaptation, climate change action plans and training, as well as how to build capacity with stakeholders and practitioners on related topics. Importantly, too, she was also a contributor to the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. She holds a PhD in public policy from our very own LKY school, NUS, and an MA in Climate and Society from Columbia University, and an MSc in Environmental Studies from Terry University. So with that, now I'm going to just review for you the plan today before turning it over to Sreeja. After she speaks in her opening remarks for about 15 minutes, I'm going to begin a moderated discussion with her. And by all means, put in the Q&A functions your questions as well. And then we're going to open it up to the audience formally for half an hour to engage in a conversation about her presentation, her book, and where these things are going. And we'll leave enough time at the end for me to tell you where to buy her book, which you really must. So with that, I turn it over and welcome Professor Sreeja Nair.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'll just share my screen and Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it is indeed my pleasure and honor to really be uh, having this opportunity to share about my book at LKY SPP. And um, it, as I was telling Ben just before uh, this meeting, that really the genesis of this book was totally out of curiosity. The number of years that I've worked in India and worked on environmental policy, the whole idea of putting a book together was just out of interest in this whole field of how do policymakers design for the long term? How do they take decisions despite the uncertainty that's there about how the future is going to evolve? And much of my research um, prior to coming to LKY school as well has been on helping the governments and working with the communities on how to make these decisions which could last, which could be as short as, just one cropping season to say a decade and over. And much of my research around that has been on the tools which can help governments make these decisions. And one of the tools has been on policy experimentation and piloting. And my idea of piloting just before I started this research was on, it's something new, it's something different. Sometimes it could be radical. And I think this is a good moment for me to actually talk about the cover of the book as well. So when the publisher asked me that, do you want to choose a cover for your book? And I was looking at images which come out when I put piloting, experiment, and when I put piloting, apart from images of, airports and pilots, the other set of images which were coming up were, you know, several parallel lines and one line kind of deviating, or something new, something different. And it just made me realize that the whole idea of piloting always makes us, or at least in research, makes us feel like it's something new, it's something different, it's radical. And what I find in my research that it doesn't necessarily have to be so. And so what you see on the cover is actually a patchwork, a patchwork image, which is kind of meant to be like a visual metaphor of pilots really being interspersed with policies, and pilots being of various forms, shapes, and sizes. And it could really it could really, at any point, it could come up and either lead the policy into a new direction, or it's really interspersed, and you can't really make where a pilot has really made an imprint on an ongoing policy. So just to kind of set a context for when we talk of piloting, how this whole research changed the way I looked at piloting, which is why the title, Rethinking Policy Piloting. And also the movement from a pilot to policy. What is this process like? What is this journey like? So these were some questions which really motivated me for this research and brought me till here. And just to start on, now what exactly are policy experiments and pilots? And me and Ben will talk about it a bit later in a conversation around trying to untangle what really a policy experiment is. Now, the word experiment and pilot, they're really not tied into these watertight compartments. And sometimes it's very difficult to see where did an experiment end and a pilot begin. And the sequence is also not very clear that an experiment led into a pilot. It could just have started as a pilot, or it could be just an experiment which then turns into a policy. So much of my research around these terminologies, the way, say, a policy experiment is understood in, say, economics, it's a bit different when we see policy experiments and pilots in practice. Really, what both these terms are meaning to say in terms of policy practice is that these are predictive tools to pre-test policies before these are launched fully. And they are controlled over time and space. That means they're limited in terms of how long that they are originally intended to run for, and also the spatial scale over which these operate. And what is experimental in these pilots? It's really uncertainty about their applicability to a particular policy problem. and also the context on implementation. You may have a pilot, but will it really meet its intended goal during implementation? And how to demonstrate its superiority among multiple other policy alternatives that a policymaker could have chosen. So this is really the experimental part of a pilot. Now, if you ask me how is a pilot different from an experiment, a pilot is, how I see it, is it is an advanced form or a more formal form of experimentation, but it's not really clear that every pilot might have had an experimental stage behind the scene, that is, before it comes out into the public. There could have been a small experimental stage where policymakers are kind of discussing, they have some ideas, they might have tested it, but it's not formally documented, it's not formally invested in, but there are these ideas which could have been experimental, but pilots in that sense, in terms of the resources that a pilot gets in terms of administrative personnel, financial allocations, just the entire planning of a pilot, it's a more advanced form, a more formal form of policy experimentation. And this is the key aspect. It's moving from looking at whether the idea will work to how these will work. So when we are looking at a kind of experiment in the true sense, it could really fail, it could go anyways. And the idea is to really see whether it will work or not. But pilots, as I see in practice, at least in the Indian agriculture context, the whole idea is how these will work. How can we make it work? What are the fine nuances in terms of implementing this, in terms of making it roll out in a successful manner, and things like that. Now, I would like to underscore everything that I said with this fact that experiments are political. And we'll talk a bit about it after my presentation, that experiments are political. In practice, the way experiments are designed, there are a lot of factors at play which lead to a pilot being a success or not. Moving on to why Indian agriculture. Now, really, it is a test bed for piloting because of the following reasons. Now, 2/3 of India is under rain-fed agriculture. That is, it depends on rains, with lack of clear, irrigation sources for agriculture productivity. And there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how the agriculture production in that particular year or season would be. A high amount, percentage of GDP is dependent on this sector, and it employs nearly half of the population in India. The sector also faces several challenges and risks, which ranges from climate change, issues with the markets and how it would play out, the regulatory and institutional risks and challenges that might be there. Is a farmer aware of what kind of policies are there to support them? So there are several challenges, and the soil fertility is declining, the rainfall patterns are changing. So there are many challenges which are faced by Indian agriculture. Now, Indian agriculture, for those who are not aware of how it is structured, is that it has a federal governance structure. So from the national level, agriculture is a state subject, so it's implemented at the national level. It's announced at the national level, a national pilot, but it will be implemented at the state level. It is a state subject. And this is the interesting part, that there are statewide variations in policy implementation, because there are differences in capacities and resources that each state has, and also the extent of agriculture that a state has, the kind of climatic risks that a state faces, the small and marginal farmers that every state has. In terms of risk management, now this was my focus of my research, that what are the risk management strategies in agriculture? There is a mix of ex ante and ex post measures. Ex ante meaning, so before there is any kind of crisis for agriculture production, say floods, droughts, or a bad season, a bad crop year, there are a lot of strategies in terms of, say, agriculture extension, giving farm inputs in terms of water, fertilizers, seeds, and general infrastructure that can help the sector. These are all ex-ante measures which the government should provide on a regular basis. And then there are ex-post measures, which is after, say, some kind of crisis has happened. So insurance, credit, loans, measures like that. And these measures could be formal, that is provided by government and government agencies, and informal. So farmers kind of sharing assets amongst themselves, or just in a very informal manner, taking money from, say, money lenders. But these are all informal measures. My focus was on formal measures, which the government provides for agriculture risk management. Now, this is the most important point, that 83% of farmers in India are small and marginal. That is, their land holdings are very small. So their own capacities to invest in the sector and to recover from any kind of risks is very low, which is why public sector investment and the role of the government in really boosting the sector becomes very, very important. And which is why we are having this conversation today. The outcome of interest, which I was interested in studying, was diffusion of a pilot. Now, the term scaling up of a pilot is the one which is most commonly used. And most of the studies around piloting and scaling up has been done by NGOs, by international donor organizations. But what was not seen so commonly when I started working on this topic was pilots which are launched by the national government. How do they approach this whole idea of piloting? And what does it mean to have kind of a more experimental or a pilot kind of mindset at the national level? What does it look like? And in my research, I came across this term diffusion. Now, the term diffusion really means continuation of a pilot in some form or the other. And as you see the figure on the right-hand side, a pilot could lead to multiple pilots. It could also move to something more permanent in terms of moving into a project. Then it could scale up. And by scaling up, really, we are meaning increasing in complexity of the pilot, the components of the pilot, and also the administrative layers and actors who are involved in the pilot. This is what scaling up really means. And eventually, the pilot could also get institutionalized into a policy. So this part is what scaling up means. Now, what I feel is the real contribution of part of my research is to see that a pilot can evolve in so many ways and still contribute to improved policy designs. It doesn't have to be an all or none, that a pilot succeeded or failed. And generally, the whole approach towards piloting has been more focusing on geographic expansion. Did it move from its pilot scale to, did it move from one district to several districts, one state to several states, or the entire nation? And I argue that a pilot could actually move in several forms. And in that limited form also, it can contribute to improved policy design. So policy translation of the pilots is a less studied outcome. The focus largely has been on geographic expansion, reaching more beneficiaries. But how does it translate into policy is a less studied outcome. And this is the one that I was most interested in. And what is behind this kind of translation? There's a combination of design features which is at play. Now, the search for these pilots was a challenging one because there is no ready-made list of pilots, because it's not done as a periodic or regular feature of government. So I chose the period of study as 1990 to 2015. 1990 because that was the decade which saw liberalization reforms in agriculture and also decentralization reforms. And then I just chose, a 25-year time period since then. This was the most challenging part of where do I go searching for these pilots. So what I did was in 2 phases. I undertook some consultations with state governments, central government, which is the Ministry of Agriculture, which is based in New Delhi, and NGOs, research institutes, which are involved in agriculture research in India. And through these consultations and also review of the 5-year plans for agriculture and also the Ministry of Agriculture annual reports, just fishing out where has the word pilot kind of come up in all these documentation? How many pilots have really been launched? And I identified 13 pilots. Now, 13 may seem a very small number for such, for 25 years and for a huge country like India. But actually, when you look at it, I was not looking at state level piloting. I was looking at national level. And it's not very often that, you see piloting at the national level. It's a huge country with a lot of statewide variations. And the agriculture context is also very different in terms of the soil, the crops, the resources which are there for the resources which are there for farmers. So 13, I would say in that sense, it's not a small number. So 13 pilots were identified, and then I had semi-structured interviews with central government and state government, selected state government officials, research institutes, NGOs, and also international donors and consultants who were directly involved either in the design of the project. So it included bureaucrats, some of them who have already retired, who were actually there designing the pilot, implementing the pilot. Some of them were involved in the evaluation of the pilots. And the real idea was to capture the content of the pilot. So these 47 interviews, which I did, so for each pilot, I had 2 to 3 interviews from key officials who were really involved in the design, implementation, and evaluation of the pilot. And the idea was to really capture the content of the pilot, its key design features, and also its evolution. How did it evolve? Where did it go? Moving on, so what I found out was there is a landscape of policy pilots, and this is my own kind of categorization. Some of them were focusing on rain-fed farming and watershed development. There was another category which focused on credit and crop insurance, and this has a maximum number of pilots, 4 different types of pilots. The third category was agriculture extension and technology demonstration. And the fourth category was pilots focusing on provision of agriculture inputs, be it in terms of information, be it in terms of fodder or organic farming. Now, the more interesting aspect is that the lifespan of these pilots actually moved from a single season. So some of the credit and crop insurance pilots, for example, the experimental crop insurance scheme and the farm income insurance scheme, they only lasted for a single season. They were terminated because they were financially very unviable for the government to continue. So the lifespan ranged from a single season to over a decade. The Indo-German Watershed Development Program, it was launched in collaboration with the government of India and a German international donor. And this lasted for over a decade. So this was again kind of a missed, but a myth that was busted for me in the sense that pilots are usually short. And in this case, I found that these pilots could actually have this huge lifespan that could be there. But typically an average lifespan, I would say, would be 4 to 5 years in what I observed in the Indian agriculture context. The unit of piloting, and I must add, I forgot to mention this earlier, that these pilots are those which were launched by the Central Ministry of Agriculture, the Department of Agriculture, either directly or in cooperation with state governments or an international donor. So they're all pilots which were launched by this particular central ministry. Now, the unit of piloting ranged from a village or a cluster of villages or several districts to several states. So this varied. The focus of these pilots moved from, some of these pilots were very supplementary and incremental measures. For example, the Accelerated Fodder Development Program, by the name accelerated itself. So there are certain fodder development schemes, but this one was launched as a supporting scheme in a particular year when there was a very massive drought in India. It was launched as a supporting scheme. So there are some measures, the National Initiative for Climate Resilient Agriculture, that was launched to kind of support other schemes which are there on water resource management, agriculture productivity improvement. So many of them were supplementary and incremental measures. There were some which were to have some new model and innovations in place. For example, the National Agriculture Technology Project. Now, this was launched when extension reforms were due in the country anyway. So this pilot kind of became a vehicle to introduce these kind of reforms a bit mildly, kind of test them before this is a large-scale change. is done. And some of the measures were, let's try a more participatory approach to watershed development, for example. And some were to really replace and reform policies. Many of the crop insurance schemes were really with the intention of, let's replace and see if there's a better crop insurance scheme that we can do. The modified national agriculture insurance scheme, for example. So the focus of these pilots really range. And in terms of the outcomes, really, we see a range of outcomes. There were 2 pilots, experimental and farm income insurance scheme, which had no diffusion. That is, they didn't move beyond their original scale, and they were actually terminated before the original intended lifespan. In just one season, they both were terminated. The next stage is, or the next level of the outcome is limited diffusion. That is, these pilots gave rise to many more pilots. For example, the National Agriculture Innovation Project, National Initiative for Climate Resilient Agriculture, they all gave rise to more pilots, but they were still at the same scale. The scale did not change. And then we had pilots which scaled up. They expanded into a bigger pilot. The scale changed, more actors came in, the components increased, or they merged into an ongoing policy. So they scaled up. And the 3 of the pilots actually institutionalized into a new policy, or they became a very core part of an existing agriculture policy mission, or for example, the National Agriculture Technology Project, it turned into a new policy altogether. So that's going back to that figure which I had shown initially, that some of these pilots just didn't scale up, but they still contributed to an improved policy design and learning along the way. So none of them were so a failure, so to say, except for perhaps the 2 pilots which didn't diffuse at all and didn't move beyond a single season. Now, moving on, how did I study these pilots? Now, this is a framework which was actually put together by Ben Cashore, and I'm very happy I'm presenting it in front of him and Michael Howlett, on that any policy can really be seen as a combination of policy goals and instruments to meet these goals. And this can be at 3 levels. What is the general idea behind this particular policy? What are the specific objectives, which is the next level? So they are kind of nested in each other. And then what are the specifications on ground of what is the on-ground requirement of the policy? And even in terms of the instrument, what kind of logic drives this instrument? For example, do we need market forces to play? Do we need kind of some command and control measure? And then what kind of tools will adhere to that kind of logic? And then what are the specific ways in which this instrument will be applied? So I thought this framework was a good way of teasing out elements of the pilot as well, because pilots, according to me, are nothing but time and space delimited policies. So they can also be studied as a combination of policy goals and instruments. So I tease out these elements of the 13 pilots in this particular book. Then I went on to generate case narratives. Now, there were 4 features that I was studying. One is the vision of the pilot. Now, the vision of all these 13 pilots, it ranged from a very broad vision, a highly flexible design, which intended to learn along the way. Now, a broad vision, mind you, doesn't mean that they didn't know what they were doing. It was just highly experimental in nature. And there was more leeway in terms of that, let's see how it goes. And many of these pilots were actually those which involved international donors. So there was a little more kind of room for risk-taking or just innovation, so to say. And on the other hand, we have pilots which had a very clear vision and high intentionality. This is why we are launching this pilot. 5 years from now, this is how we see it integrating into an ongoing policy. There was a fixed plan for replication, expansion, and even institutionalization. And so this was one of the features that I was studying. And there were some pilots which were in between these 2 extremes. The second feature that I studied was governance, that who are the stakeholders, who are the players involved in the design and implementation of these pilots. So on one extreme, we had very heavily centralized, setup. Central government is the main in charge and the state governments are implementing it. And on the other side, we had central government again being the nodal authority, but there are more than one type of non-governmental agency, private sector, international donors involved. Now, going back to the framework that I just mentioned in the previous slide, I also looked at, let's see what change in how different was this pilot in terms of pursuing new goals to an ongoing policy. Now, all these pilots were launched with reference to an ongoing scheme or a policy. So we had pilots which pursued totally new goals to ongoing policies, and other pilots which were actually pursuing the same goals and just acting as a supplementary measure. And then means or instruments. So there were some pilots which were driven by a new instrument logic. For example, insurance schemes. There was one insurance scheme which was talking of, okay, this doesn't work, the markets have to operate and the government can't decide. So it was totally a new instrument logic trying to achieve either the same goals or new goals. And then on the other side, we have pilots which are using pretty much the same instruments, organizational or financial or authoritative instruments to bring, and only kind of the changes that you observe are on the ground, small changes in which, or small ways in which the same instruments are being applied as a routine policy, a regular policy, but just making small tweaks in how they are being applied. So another part of my research actually looked at how do and I've studied these 4 features, but how do they interplay with each other? So I employed this particular method, which is called qualitative comparative analysis, in which concepts such as scaling up, which are so dynamic and there are several factors at play, they can be studied as set relations. For example, whether, for example, vision, is it broad vision or a very narrow vision? So it's kind of, and how does it contribute to scaling up? So the outcome that I was studying here was diffusion, which involves, moving from pilots leading to more pilots to kind of scaling up to potential institutionalization. And the variables that I was studying, the 4 design features that I was studying become the variables. And I was interested in seeing how do these work together? And is there any pattern that I can see in these 13 pilots? If I had more number of pilots, that would have been excellent, because for QC, it kind of just, you get a more kind of solid pattern kind of emerging if you have more number of cases. But even with these limited number of cases, I was able to see some interesting patterns emerge. And a major challenge in this case is that pilots are not reported as often. And so data and the documentation is really a challenge. Which is why interviews and document analysis, I had to triangulate all the information that I could get about these pilots. So this is the kind of model which I used for conducting this qualitative comparative analysis to see, do I see any patterns in this data? What are the patterns of high diffusion and low diffusion? And what I find out was, and this is just the last 2 slides that I have now, that there are many routes for a pilot to assimilate into routine policymaking. The factors that could lead to high diffusion, what I found out was when non-governmental actors are involved in a pilot's governance, then there is kind of an experimentation with new policy goals, trying out new ideas, new policy goals. And my hunch about this, and this is my own observation and also talking to those who were involved in some of these pilots, was that having non-governmental actors kind of gives that slight more room to take risks or try something new. And there are also resources which are shared. So there's a little more room to experiment with new ideas, new policy goals. The second route, which I observed for in cases where there was high diffusion, was that there was a very clear vision for diffusion. And even if there is no governmental partnerships and there is no changes in the kind of policy experiments that are being used, if there is a clear vision for diffusion, and these are centrally initiated pilots, so if there is a clear vision that this is where the pilot is going, this is where the end policy objective is, then definitely, and this, I mean, good or bad, the pilot will most likely reach that. So these are the different routes in which, or the different combinations in which high diffusion was observed in these 13 cases. Now, what about low diffusion? The the cases where low diffusion was seen was where there was a very broad vision as in, there is no clear end objective, either geographically or policy integration. So even though the pilot actually resembles a lot like an ongoing policy in terms of its goal and instruments, one would think that a pilot which says the same thing as an ongoing policy would get scaled up. There is no obstacle, stakeholders are happy. But if there is a very broad vision, the pilots would not scale up, would not diffuse and scale up. Now, this doesn't mean that the pilot was a failure. It just means that it has assimilated in a different way by just leading to more pilots or moving into a project, but it's not really scaled up. And finally, some insights for policy practice. What does it show? What does it indicate about piloting in Indian agriculture? Now, these pilots have actually had substantial financial resource commitment and political commitment. So piloting, one would think, at least when I started this research, I thought, if there is a new idea, you want to try something out, why not just pilot? But actually piloting also comes with a lot of resource commitment and political commitment. There are high stakes with the performance of the pilot and its popularity among beneficiaries. So policymakers are always wary of how a pilot would perform. So it's just as full policies, pilots are also political. The successful design, implementation, and diffusion of pilots is by no means automatic. There is a whole range of factors which is working behind the pilot and actually pushing it through. And the tricky part with national pilots is, in a country like India, that how should these national level pilots transform national priorities while adjusting and balancing expectations for the diverse state context and priorities. Sometimes I'll hear state government officials saying that, the central government has told us to do this, but we are doing this anyway on our own or in a different way, which they might think is the better way. So there are these diverse state contexts that a national government official has to be mindful of. And non-governmental actor networks are also instrumental to scaling up, even if these pilots were driven by the central government initially. So I'll stop at that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later.
Okay. First of all, let me say thank you. You can see how this was such an important piece of work because it conducted significant research in the field, but then from that developed overall concepts that apply beyond the case itself. And I want to delve into some of those broader implications of Sreeja in the beginning of our fireside chat that we're going to have with me and her, and then I'll follow up with the audience. And so to begin that conversation, I would love her thoughts on two related questions. So one is, when looking at the stories of successful diffusion, which I think you nicely pointed out, didn't necessarily mean full adoption into full policy, but had their own learning effects too. Did you find any differences in terms of the problems that they tried to address? So of course your cases look at different problems, but I'm thinking more of the broader set of problems that we in policy schools face. Things, for example, poverty alleviation. Of course, the climate crisis is an obvious one, where in fact, in those cases, human beings are often the cause of the degradation to the ecology. And then of course, climate adaptation, where feedback loops mean that vulnerable populations have to deal with adapting to these human-caused impacts. So from things that are more human-centered to more ecology-centered to, let's say, more economic-centered, how did you get any sort of ideas about then, do your stories of diffusion, successful diffusion, actually in part vary depending upon the problems that governments were facing? And I'll come back to a second question once you reflect on that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the problems that some of the problems were as wide ranging as just watershed development. And some were as kind of very, not straightforward, but more pointed and targeted, like how do we just get more farmers under a particular insurance scheme? What is a better insurance scheme? Now, improved watershed development is much more complex than that. And it also takes several, at least minimum 5 years, 10 years, or even more to actually have communities engaged in that partnership on developing a piece of land well and to actually see any successful outputs. Now, an insurance scheme, for example, is simpler in the sense that you can see the output more faster, whether it's working or not. You could kind of see. So it's a less complex problem to solve in that sense, in the sense that you can see the results immediately faster than, say, a watershed development, a pilot for watershed development. But still, on the other side, the two schemes which actually failed were actually insurance schemes, because as soon as they ran into financial issues, as soon as it didn't seem financially viable, they were just dismantled, and then off they moved to another insurance scheme. For example, a watershed development scheme could just kind of linger on for a very long time. It may not really be as good and successful, but it would just linger on because you can still see some benefits of it coming, community engagement, or you've certain, hectares of land has actually flourished under this particular scheme. So there is a little more capacity to demonstrate that something has been done, something good has been done as part of this pilot, as compared to, say, an insurance, which if it fails, it's much more visible, so to say. And, the failure is more visible. So then another project tackled this issue of climate change adaptation and innovations for climate change adaptation. And now that again was very tricky because water resource management, improving crop varieties, or just having more efficient irrigation measures, changing the crop cycles a bit, or looking at different varieties of crops, mix cropping, things like that. India and Indian farmers and research institutes, that they've been doing it for several decades. So I remember that during my interviews, this point kind of came up, that what is it that this pilot is kind of doing differently? And we have been doing all these measures. So to demonstrate, and this is an issue with adaptation in general, to demonstrate that additionality of efforts in terms of what additional is being done to deal with the change that that you might see in the climate in terms of beyond climate variability. How is this particular measure able to deal with that additionality? So these challenges were very wide-ranging, so to say. And some of these pilots were able to demonstrate success, so to say, or more easily than the others.
Thank you. That raises another question that goes from the problems themselves, which I want to come back to shortly in my third question, to then thinking about then the reasons why you might get less permanence or less diffusion. In terms of that wonderful table you showed, the 2x3 Cashore-Hallett table. And I'm curious whether, for example, you might get more diffusion when you're focusing on the technical aspects of policy, the calibrations, the settings. For example, in your watershed, the things that are around, you're not really sure yet about how much enforcement you need, how many resources you need, and so on. And so you pilot to learn around these important but tinkering aspects of policy, versus the ones that are more around, bold policy tools that are different, like market regulations or ESG commitments or something, which maybe then the reason why they fail is because governments learn, they're just not going to actually be effective, right? So is there a difference in your uptake and your sort of lessons learned about diffusion, depending upon whether we're looking at the policy tinkering side or more of the tools, broader tool side of things?
Yeah, so definitely those pilots which were kind of doing this tinkering at the settings level. So just let's pursue the same goals or similar goals, use similar instruments, but just make small variations in how these are used. For example, if there's a crop insurance scheme, let's just change the premium amounts a bit. Or let's just, if there's a watershed schemes, let's just change how how participatory it is. Let's just try a new approach in that sense. So just making small changes at the settings level, at the ground level, using the same instruments. And many times, pilots, and this is even in the interviews, it came up that, we already had these kind of mechanisms. We already had these extension, agencies which were there, and they're already doing this work. We know that these states are already very resourceful and the farmers are very progressive. So why not encash on that? And why not kind of make it happen? And why not make it's a more efficient use of resources from a very practical perspective. And so that's why these pilots kind of went beyond and actually became a vehicle to move to a full-fledged policy or a new policy or a pilot which merged into a policy. The instances where I saw some high-level changes happening, let's have a new instrument in place, let's have a new instrument logic in place, were when external donors were involved. A large share of money was coming from an external donor, an international aid agency, for example. There was a little more innovation or risk-taking, so to say, that let's just try and do something differently. And my guess is that it's exactly because there was this spreading of risks that, it's not just the government, but government is doing something in partnership with another agency. And there you see more tinkering at the higher, goals level, at the abstract level, or at the instrument logic level, and not really at the settings level.
Which I think, that speaks to me around the questions then of pilots for the purposes of creating political feasibility in some way, from pilots around learning around, design of the tool itself. And that leads me to a question then about your notion of scaling up. And the question I want to pose to you is, does the metaphor scaling up kind of therefore take pilots to mean they have to be more localized in nature? And I'm raising that question because I was wondering, and I know I discussed with you before, the idea of scaling down. So let's say you're a national government that brought in a pilot that applied all across the country, let's say to all gas stations, right? But the reason why it was a pilot was because it was a fixed life and they wanted to see if it worked. And they might bring it to other areas later, but they wanted to do all gas stations. That wouldn't be local per se, but if it worked, it might scale down to other communities. So I'm wondering, is there kind of in the literature on piloting a bias towards decentralized governance as the place to start, or can you also scale down?
Yeah, so there is definitely a bias towards these more decentralized, pilots or pilots which start from a small scale to up, and that's bulk of the literature actually. But scaling down is a different challenge altogether, because even though, so when you're scaling up from, say, a small village or a smaller initiative, and let's see how far it goes, it has a different set of challenges. For example, will we get enough money to sustain it? How many administrative, personnel are required? How Can you hear me now?
Yes, we now can hear you. Yeah. We lost you for about a minute or half a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. So when it is scaling down, then the issue is different. So you have high political will, you have a lot of resources, but how do you translate very broad, national priorities into something that would be taken up by the local level, or it will match what other state level priorities, for example, in Indian agriculture, will it be implemented the same way across states which have different capacities, different priorities? would the same national pilot be implemented equally across all states? So that is a challenge of scaling down of a more larger ambition or a vision, and when it kind of comes down. But it starts the same way, but I mean, the size, the geographical scale would be larger. It would, instead of starting from one village, they might be in several states. But again, the challenge is the same, that it's how much will it be adopted? And will the adoption of that idea or the pilot be uniform? Will the success be uniformly seen? Will the uptake be seen uniformly? Yeah.
Interesting point you make around already having the political will. Your argument is that nationally, if they do this, there's more likelihood of there being political support. I do wonder then, this concept of trial balloons that governments would often engage at all levels, right? Just to see, it wasn't a pilot at all, it was simply an idea. And then if it got shot down, they wouldn't even go to a pilot, right? Did you engage the trial balloon, literature in terms of where they decided to run pilots at all?
So I did observe this at the state level, but not so much at the national level. And I do recall a central, government official actually saying that, no, this is not an experiment, this is a pilot.
Right.
So there was almost like an aversion to the word experiment. And from the literature, it's really because the governments don't want to be seen as being unsure of what they want to do, or trying out on the citizens, for example. Let's see how this works. And that's why there is like this absolute aversion. And my book actually argues that there should not be this aversion. And because a pilot can actually contribute in so many ways. But at the state level, there was more of this kind of, trial balloons kind of seen in partnership with local NGOs and the private sector. It was more probably because the scale was smaller and they could try something out at their own expense, or using some of their resources, or just invite private sector or international donors to that, okay, we support you, and you could kind of have your trial balloons with our support, as long as we don't have to pay for it. So as long as that money kind of comes from outside,
right.
I actually observed, even though it's not in my cases because I was only looking at central government initiated ones, but at the national level, these might have happened behind closed doors, which never kind of really came outside. And there could have been some trial balloons which were busted and didn't really move ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting because your insights, as you pointed out in your last two slides, carry implications for both theory, but also practice, actual real world conversations. So on the one hand, it's an abstract conversation around balloons and pilots and where they come in. On the other hand, it really matters to opening up the toolbox for governments to think about when to use these and how. It's that important, really. So I've now got my favorite question I'm going to ask you, okay? So it's actually a two-part question. The question's going to come across as very confusing. I'm going to make two different points, okay? And so the first question is, aren't all policies in some way experiments? Governments are always adapting, learning from their policies, always changing depending upon political feasibility and impacts and so on. So couldn't you just say this is simply a case around policies that had a short shelf life versus really around the question of experiments? But then I'm going to also ask you the same question to ponder this following question. Aren't some problems so difficult, like the climate crisis? To go back to Riddle and Weber's wicked problems and my work with Levinel and Bernstein, super wicked problems. Aren't some problems so difficult, with time running out so fast, like COVID, like climate, that there's no time to experiment? In other words, piloting would never work because you need to act immediately and hope for the best with a proper design. So two kind of strange questions to bundle up, but I love your thoughts on both those questions together.
Okay, on the first one, aren't all policies experimental? I think all policies are experimental. And the government will never accept that. But just for the reason I told earlier, that they don't want to be seen as running a trial all the time, being unsure of what they want to do. So even though behind the scenes, it's kind of all policies are experimental, but in the sense that they could be dismantled, they could be changed, there could be reforms. But then why don't we see policy termination and dismantling so commonly?
Right.
Because it's just so many, it's so difficult for a policy to, even if it's not functioning well, to really terminate. There are legacies, there are stakeholders involved, so even bad policies continue in that sense.
Right.
But
Right.
pilot, kind of with its limited shelf life, kind of offers that higher degree of freedom, if I may say so, that that it's limited in time, limited in space. It kind of gives you, in India, in my cases, for example, they were perfectly timed with the 5-year plans. So whenever the 5-year plan, kind of one plan ended, there was a like this, okay, should it run another round, or just we merge it into an existing policy? So that pilot kind of gave them that freedom of changing its course at, just because it was limited in time and space. But I do agree that inherently all policies are also experimental in nature. And in pilots, there's another kind of additional freedom that the governments have, that they, at the bare minimum, they could, even if it fails, they could say, okay, at least we learned something. At least, we learned that this particular idea doesn't work, even though there are reputational issues of a failed pilot as well.
Right.
And on the second question, on that some issues like climate change being so complex that there isn't enough time to kind of just experiment and learn from them. Sometimes you just need to go ahead and launch something. So over there, piloting can actually, what they can offer is giving a variation in the number of policy options that could be put out, just giving a menu of options, that is, introducing this kind of number of policy alternatives that a policymaker could actually consider. The insurance schemes, for example, 4 insurance pilots that were there. So eventually 2 of them were offered as part of a larger insurance scheme, that there is this option of choosing one over the other. So it just increased the kind of risk, the kind of risk management portfolio, that you have the option of taking this scheme or being party to this other scheme. So pilots in that sense can kind of give that menu of options to the policymaker, specifically to tackle very complex problems like climate change, or like the pandemic now, when there isn't enough time to act and kind of really test something out, and a decision needs to be made.
So there you're equating pilots with potentially multiple simultaneous efforts to address problems that can't really be subject to experiments, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Yeah, and that fits from the literature already on sort of bottom-up levers and so on for the climate crisis, and of course COVID. Nobody would have said, "Hey, let's experiment." Let's shut down human interaction because the disease happens so fast. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, really fascinating, and I think again really important around linking what you're doing to actual problems in ways that I think can really be helpful to governments. We have some questions now I want to turn to for the next part of our fireside chat, and I want to first go to maybe 2 at once. The first 2. So Alden Lee says, thanks for the insightful presentation, ! I would just like to clarify, how were the pilots themselves identified? Okay, maybe I'll ask you that question first. Yeah.
Okay, so how these were identified was, first I did a number of consultations in India on talking to people from the central government and few of the state governments from these large agricultural states, of which pilots in the last 25 years or so do they remember as being very useful for, they've influenced policy, which pilots, which pilots do they recall? Have they worked on these pilots? Which have their departments kind of used? So that, along with doing document analysis, I went through the agriculture annual reports of the Ministry of Agriculture every year for these 25 years, the 5-year action plans, the agriculture section of that, to just sift through where the word pilot has been used, which of the strategies have been launched with the intention of being a pilot. Now, there is a limitation in the sense that these should have had the term pilot in that. And there could be other policies which were kind of short-lived as well, but really this, because there's no ready-made list and it's not done as a regular activity. So this was the only way of identifying these pilots. And then I went through, these consultations kind of continued of kind of cross-verifying with these people that, okay, so I have these so I had a longer list from which it was shortened to 13 pilots, which actually meet the criteria that they are launched by the central government. They have, they have had at least one evaluation, for example, and they are, they have, the idea of the pilot is something that could be taken across the country, not just specific states. So there was a number of criteria which I used to identify these 13 pilots.
That's really interesting too, and I think a really important response to an illustration for doctoral students about how to generate insights around phenomenon that might not be super clean cut to be identified, but actually by doing this work conceptually, you get at these phenomena in really important ways. I want to go to a really interesting question from Vikash Haridas, who says, thanks for presenting the case of piloting within the context of a multi-state within a single government, India. Keen to hear your thoughts on the applicability of the framework and usage of pilots for policymaking within the context of an intergovernmental organization, like within the South African developing countries, the African Union, etc. That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, and challenging one for sure. So within an intergovernmental organization, say if the problem context is, say, agriculture, risk management, the whole different governments have different their risk aversion might be different. Their approach towards piloting might be different. For example, the way UK takes up piloting versus India versus China. These are three, China and UK both have instances of involving experimentation as part of their policy making, but the approaches are so different. So in this case, what could be done would be maybe some kind of a comparison in terms of the approach towards piloting. One is a more top-down approach, and one is a more that let's allow several pilots to run, and then let it kind of emerge from bottom up. So the approach towards taking risk, the approach towards piloting might be different. So something about the policy styles, maybe if I go back to policy literature, then this whole approach towards piloting might be different, and that kind of a comparison could be done between countries, for example. And that could be one way in which this could be applied, the same framework for the same policy problem, but just a different approach towards piloting.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to go to a question from Mary, who actually returns to a theme that we've talked a bit about the problems themselves and do they matter. And she asked the question, thanks for sharing this. Are there certain types of policies which are not suitable for experimental policy? And what are those?
Okay, very interesting question. And in fact, I was giving a lecture to a university in India, and one of them asked me about, so there was, recently there were these in India, they had a set of new farm laws, which was actually met with a lot of agitation and protest from the farmers because it was thought to be more corporate friendly and less farmer friendly. And so the question that I was asked was that, if they would have launched it as a pilot or kind of tested it out first, wouldn't it have been better? And my answer to that was that if there is no intention to kind of test an idea, if there is every reason for the policymaker to actually go ahead with an idea, knowing that it would meet with a lot of resistance, just because the topic is sensitive, and that if they run a pilot, if they run an experiment, if they allow this idea to sneak out before, in any pilot form, and there's going to be a huge backlash, they will never launch it as an experiment because there is no intention to learn from it. Actually, the intention is just to go ahead with the idea. So sensitive topics or topics where the policymakers have no intention to, they know that this has to come about and this would meet with resistance, but we are just going ahead with it. In that instance, there is no reason for them to launch an experiment, knowing that there would be a lot of backlash and it would never see the light of the day, for example.
Oh, that's interesting. So on the one hand, we talked about using pilots to improve political feasibility to help governments achieve their goals. But you're saying the opposite is also true, that sometimes they can't turn to this if they just want to do something.
Yeah, because there is no intention to get feedback and learn. There's every intention to just go ahead, good on with acceptable or not, we are just going ahead with it.
And again, based on your conversations and Mary's question, I suspect then that in part whether a government just goes ahead, maybe a function of the authority the government has, but also a function of the problem they're trying to face too, right? Yeah. That's more rhetorical question, but yeah, you can just say yes.
Yes.
But fascinating, really fast. And again, see, your book's so important because we're dancing between theory, but then the theory is around a practical question. If you're a government official and you've got a certain problem, they got to read your book to know then whether or not it makes sense to use pilots or not, right? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of this? So it's very practical too.
And I just want to add, really what I wanted to do with this book was really to say that policymakers should not be afraid of pilots, thinking that they can only be radical and they can only be all or none, if it either succeeds or it fails. And researchers also, at the other hand, have to regulate their enthusiasm a bit in the sense of what a pilot can achieve. It's not really always out there to make a huge splash. They could also not make a huge splash and yet contribute to better policy design and learning.
Yeah, I'm going to make a comment and then go to another question. So I think you raised an interesting point that often applies to international relations, especially in the environment, where a lot of folks argue instead of doing a big omnibus convention on some kind of global problem, you start small and you just get a little leverage point in by saying, oh, we'll have a protocol on something, right? And that allows for this to build later. So I imagine that politically, a pilot could be raised at the cabinet level, for example, where you're debating ministries, right? And they say, oh yeah, okay, we agree nobody's going to agree on a big, huge program, but we'll agree on a pilot, right? I can imagine it's an easier sell at the cabinet level, right?
Yeah.
That's my kind of comment. I got to go to a question actually, because time is running out now, which is another problem we need a pilot for. Yuhal Bao says, excellent presentation, Professor Nair, exclamation mark. A quick question. How did you differentiate between diffusions into policies versus pilots?
Okay, so some pilots actually moved into expanding and and integrating into, say, an ongoing policy, but they didn't actually get a life of their own, a separate life of their own, in the sense that the pilot itself became a new policy. And there were others which just integrated into something that was ongoing, became a kind of part of a larger mission on sustainable agriculture. It kind of merged into it or bundled into it, but there were some which actually themselves became a new policy. So that was kind of the full institutionalization, so to say.
Okay,
but they both are instances of diffusion.
Yeah, okay, that's fascinating too. We've got just a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I want to save a couple of minutes for the very end. So the last question from Navarun Varma is, thank you for the great talk. did you observe the role of science in selection of pilots or their implementation or scaling up?
Probably one or two, which were more technical in nature. For example, there was one pilot on just having technological innovations for risk management. And the kind of agencies at the local level that it was integrating were also those who were involved in research and development and agriculture. And the more technical side of it there, the role of science kind of I've observed more than say watershed development, where it was more let's bring the people into it, let's just engage them more. And there was less kind of science, and the technical aspects were lesser. And insurance as well, where it was very what works in the market, where should we set the premium levels, and what should be the payout be like, a weather-based crop insurance, where should the threshold be for triggering of these payments. So there I observed more of the role of science.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now have to end this part of our fireside chat and say thank you for a really wonderful, engaging talk, and the link from theory to practice, and then the ideas for how governments can use these tools is really important, not just in the context of India, which itself is important enough, but also in the context of the biggest problems facing the planet and governments generally. So because of that, and the importance of that impact of your book, our job now as an audience is to recognize two things. One, this is part of the broader LKY School's mission, right? Policy design, policy innovation, policy learning in ways that can assist governments in better achieving their goals. So that means this book has got to make major sales, okay? So now our job, our collective job, is to have this book bought, okay? So you guys got to go to all your LinkedIn accounts, okay? Individual ones and so on, and you got to promote this book and how important it is for governments around the world, okay? So that's our job. You need a KPI, high KPIs of getting this book sold. You have two options. One, you can go to Cambridge Press itself. There's the QR code for Cambridge Press, or you can go to Amazon, and help out the guy Bezos, who's just begun $1 billion fund to help address the climate crisis. Okay, so Amazon or Cambridge Press, you can go there and you can buy this book, and you can leave positive comments and get this thing sold. Okay, that's our mission as a community here at LKY School. We're part of a collective effort, and we want this book to make an impact for two reasons. One, it's good for the world. And two, it's good for our school. And actually three, it's also good for Sreeja, and this kind of effort that she's put in earns that effort. So that's my sales pitch and to end this effort. And so please do, this interview is also being recorded. You can send it to people afterwards as well, but please get out there and go spread the word about the important work being done by Sreeja in the context of our school. So with that, I would like you all to join me in thanking Professor Sreeja Nair for a wonderful talk and book. And I can't see any of you because it's Zoom world and everything else, but I assume you're clapping too with me, right? And thank you very much for a really wonderful, engaging presentation.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much, everyone who's on the call with us today.